Metals and blacksmiths have historically been associated with a lot of bad associations in Middle Eastern traditions. And you can see this in that metals generally are associated with various consonant roots within Semitic languages with less than positive connotations, generally. For example, in Arabic, though this also applies to other Semitic languages. You have, for example, the root for copper, nuhas, known sin. It's also the root for calamity, nars. And copper itself, nuhas, is also derived from a form that is associated with bad things, like sicknesses and diseases. And this is important because in Semitic languages, words are generated through shared consonantal roots or a pattern of certain consonants that have their own inherent meaning and to which you attach various other patterns of sounds to create various forms that also have their own meanings too. And thus having certain consonants and having certain forms are indications of certain meanings to words and associations with certain words. And the associations with copper are very negative. But why are they so negative? Why is copper associated with calamities, for example? And there are multiple reasons for this. One reason I will mention now and some others that I will mention later. The first reason might be that copper can be very poisonous when in contact with low pH water. Or rather, copper when in contact with acidic water can create chemicals that make the water poisonous and undrinkable. Though on the other hand, copper in high pH water can be good, as then the copper only kills germs in the water and actually makes the water drinkable. And is actually a trick that was used in the past to make water drinkable. To place potential drinking water in a copper vessel and let it stay there for a while. Though again, this only worked with certain types of water. If the water was acidic, you would instead turn the water poisonous and thus unfit for human consumption. And it is possible that in the past, when people did not know about the chemistry behind copper potentially turning water poisonous or being beneficial, that people mistakenly took acidic water at times into a copper vessel and then got poisoned due to drinking that water. And as a consequence of this, the association between calamities and copper might be the result of people having gotten poisoned due to having drunk poisoned water, due to not knowing about the local water conditions and if copper was safe to use in drinking vessels. Though there are other possible explanations that are also shared with other metals that I will go through later. But you also see other similar bad associations with other metals. For example, also with gold and silver, which are associated with greed. And silver, for example, is derived from the same root as for breaking things. Fidda, silver, comes from dod, which is the same root as fod, breaking or undoing or unraveling. Because the greed for silver destroys morals, relationships and creates conflicts and is highly destructive. Speaking about destructive and something that the working processes of all metals share that is destructive and potentially very dangerous. Fire. You will have to work with fire if you're going to work with metals in order to process the metals from the ore and to refine it into various shapes. And fire is not only associated with hell and the jinn, the fire spirits within Arabic folklore and Islamic traditions. But fire is also generally associated with sot and impurity. Not to mention the fire risk associated with blacksmiths working with fire. A risk that might also explain the association between calamity and copper as well, due to the risk of fire calamities. And this has been especially the case in the hot, dry climate of the Middle East. And with the Middle East, at least in early history, being rather urbanized in comparison to other places of the world, with a lot of flammable buildings that are really close to each other, and at least partially built in flammable wood and reed. For example, even mud huts and stone buildings have a lot of reed in them, as you use reed not only as a filling material, but also as a material for isolation and for the roofing. And wood is and was a commonly used material that was used for support, in the form of support beams and support structures for various buildings. And this does not even go into the types of buildings that were all built in wood or reed, like traditional reed huts in southern Iraq, and also found elsewhere where you have marshland and a lot of reed. But anyway, the point is that a lot of the buildings were very flammable and very close to each other in a very hot and dry climate. Consequently, due to the fire risks, and also due to the fact that blacksmithing is very noisy, and in a tightly packed city, like most Middle Eastern cities were and are, you can't really escape that noise, and blacksmithing would be a noisy, dangerous element in the city. Consequently, blacksmiths had to live outside of towns and cities. And this is why the word for limit, had, and the word for blacksmith, hadad, share the same root of dal, dal. The word iron, hadid, is also derived from this root as well. And the root in combination with its descriptive form also gives it an association with limitedness and being limited. Because the people that worked with iron and other metals were historically limited and outcasts, and forbidden from being inside the cities and towns. Though this was less the case in the later Middle Ages of the Middle East. But in the early Middle Ages, this was very much the case. And it was also the case before Islam and outside of the Arabic context too, as you see similar negative associations with blacksmiths in other Middle Eastern cultures. For example, in Jewish traditions, you can see an association between blacksmiths and Cain, the first murderer, and his descendants, with, for example, Tubal-Cain being known as the first blacksmith and one of the most vicious of Cain's descendants, and the one that is credited with creating the first metal weapons of war, thus creating an association between metal and murder on a large scale, as the first example of metal usage. And Cain and his descendants are also associated with being outcasts as well, though blacksmiths might have been outcasts. Being outcasts did not mean that these craftsmen should be viewed as having been badly paid either, nor should they be viewed as having been unskilled, because blacksmiths have at various points in Middle Eastern history been highly skilled and valued for their skills, even if they were not allowed to set foot into the cities. They still offered rare skills and services working with metals that were highly valued. It was just that getting into the profession of being a blacksmith was not only costly as a time investment, as you had to work as an apprentice in an apprenticeship for a rather long time in order to learn the trade, but also very costly socially, as you did get ostracized to a certain degree by being a blacksmith. And consequently, there weren't many blacksmiths around, and thus you could, due to the laws of supply and demand, also demand a higher payment for your rare skills, as you did not have a lot of competition that would force down your prices. And this also made it so that blacksmiths also got an association for being greedy too, as they could put rather high prices on their rare and valuable skills. A similar situation to the one with blacksmiths also was the case with gravediggers, that is to say undertakers, those that deal with the dead, as they were occasionally in very short supply but in very high demand due to the services that they offered, and due to the limited time frame in which you have to bury a body according to Islamic customs. Consequently, these people could at various times demand rather high payment, and thus also got stereotyped as being very greedy. And also, unlike as in the case with blacksmiths, to which this stereotype about being greedy and limited disappeared gradually in the late Middle Ages to almost completely disappear during the Ottoman period, these stereotypes about people that deal with the dead continued, and arguably are even worse in modern times than they are today, as a common insult for a gravedigger is to call a gravedigger a ghoul, or flesh-eating murderous genie, due to various stereotypes about gravediggers being greedy, just like a voracious ghoul. But in any case, I'm getting kind of off track now. And my main point was that being in a limited profession did not necessarily mean that you were poor by being in that profession, even if you were kind of on the outside of society. Though related to being poor and limited, and also associated with metals, was being a slave, as the mining of metals was the profession for slaves, and mining slaves had among the highest death rates among slaves generally, in both the Islamic world and elsewhere. Being a mining slave was to more or less be worked to death. Mining generally was terrible work, with back-breaking labor under extremely terrible conditions, either down in small claustrophobic dark tunnels inside of the mountains, or exposed to the burning heat of the sun in open mining pits. And in both cases you are also exposed to various mining incidents, such as collapsing tunnels, carbon monoxide poisoning due to the burning fires inside of the mines without proper ventilation, or landslides burying you in the pits. And you also work with a lot of other peoples under terrible conditions where diseases spread easily too, as you all work very closely to each other. And you're probably not that well cared for or well fed working in the mines, creating a fertile breeding ground for the spreading of disease. The mining of metals was associated with various types of personal calamities and catastrophes for the miners involved. And this is another additional possible reason as to why copper is associated with calamity in Arabic. Because the mining for the copper, and also other metals too generally, was associated with various possibilities of personal calamities and disasters for the miners involved. First being enslaved and then forced to work under these terrible conditions. What is that if not a personal calamity? Metals, as I stated earlier in this video, have had a lot of negative connotations historically in Middle Eastern traditions. And this also gets even more clear when you compare the associations of various metals in various Middle Eastern traditions with the associations of metals in European Western traditions, where for example silver and iron are seen as good metals that protect you from evil spirits, that are used to keep evil creatures away in various European folklore, for example. In comparison, metals in, for example, Arabic folkloric traditions are usually associated with the jinn as being utilized as tools of the potentially dangerous and evil spirits, as something that they have dominion over or are attracted to, instead of rather repelled by, thus giving metals this dangerous association with capricious, potentially evil spirits. And this is because Metals, just like the jinn themselves, are the result, or rather the product, of fire, as God created them from the fire, according to Islamic traditions. And this was metals and blacksmiths and some of their negative associations in Islamic, Arabic folkloric and general Middle Eastern historic traditions. And I hope you liked this video. Please post comments and ask questions, and I will try to respond to you as quickly as possible.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.